Hi, I'm Mahmoud, and today I'm going to show you how to take your drums from sounding like this to this. Let's get to it. First of all, this is a beginner lesson. I will over-explain almost everything and every step. If you're mixing real drums for a rock and metal context for the first time, this is very much for you. If you want to mix along with me or just try things for yourself, there's a link in the description where you can download all of these exact tracks that we're using today, including the guitars, bass, synthesizers, and vocals of this very song. It's free and it will help you learn, so go download those tracks. Mixing drums without context and additional music can sound great for Instagram or for a drum lesson or something like that, but it won't tell you if what you're doing on the drums, mixing-wise, is helping the song. We're gonna treat this like a mix that needs to be competitive in its respective genre. Given that this is a rock song, we will use additional things like samples and other tricks to enhance the drum sound, but we will be focusing on the basics, which are phase and polarity, EQ, compression, reverb, and automation. Finally, before we jump in, this is going to be in-depth and therefore might be a long video, so be patient. I want to get this right so you can learn from this as much as you can. I promise you, your patience will be rewarded. The goal is that when you're ready to mix your own song, you can come back to this video for a refresher. Also, if this helps you, please leave a comment with what you took away from this video and what kind of lesson you would like to see in the future. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more. And with that out of the way, let's jump in. This drum performance was recorded during a rehearsal of my band, City of Pillars. The song's called Didn't I, and the drummer performing on this track is called Alyosha Sulzer. Shout out to Ollie, thank you so much for letting me use this performance for this lesson. His channel is linked down below in the description, as is my band. So first things first, let's see where we're starting. These are the drums, raw, no plugins, no additional samples. This is how they sound. I mentioned in the intro that you should be using additional music, additional instruments for reference during the mixing of your drum track. However, since this is a lesson, I'm going to be just focusing on the drums for now, and I'm going to bring in the music later on. Let's start with the routing of this whole session. When I'm mixing real drums, I like to group the individual elements together. In this very case, I have two kick drum mics, one inside of the kick drum, one outside. I'm grouping these together to the kick natural bus, and from there I'm going to a kick bus. Why am I doing that? Because I know that I will be using additional samples, which are on this track here, being triggered by this MIDI track right there. All of these go together to the kick bus, which is then further routed to the drums bus. Additionally, I use a few different things, a few different effects that are in parallel. One is a reverb track, and the other is a parallel compression track. I will get to them later. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at the polarity of the tracks. What is polarity and what is phase? Let me explain. So people in the mixing community tend to use polarity and phase interchangeably. That is, however, technically wrong. Polarity refers to a binary thing, as you can see right here. Is the waveform going up or is it going down? Phase, however, is a relative thing where you're comparing two different signals to each other. When one of the signals is ahead of the other, you might refer to them as being out of phase. However, a lot of people in the mixing community use the phrase out of phase to refer to two tracks' respective signals not going in the same direction when they should be. For example, if you have two mics on a kick drum and one is going up while the other is going down, those two tracks are out of polarity. In most cases, you don't want that. With that being said, let's take a look at the phase and polarity of the kick drum mics. This is the kick drum mic that is inside of the kick drum, close to the beater. And this one is right on the sound hole of the resonance head of the kick drum. Those two are in polarity, which is good. We want that. However, if we zoom in, and if I place the marker right here, we can see that they are slightly out of phase. Realistically speaking, this is almost negligible. This is basically negligible. However, for the case of learning here, I'm going to just nudge this slightly back. That way, they're perfectly in phase now and in polarity. Now we're going to play the kick drum, and I'm going to flip the polarity. Even here it's called phase, which is wrong. It's polarity. I'm going to flip the polarity on one of the kick drum mics to show you how drastic of a difference it is when they're not in polarity. As you can tell, all of the low end disappears, and usually you really don't want that. There's cases where you might, but that's that. So we're going to start the mix by looking at the kick drum. I like to have the kick drum at a certain volume hitting my master bus. And the reason for that is I want to build the mix around the kick drum mic itself. Why am I picking the kick drum? That's just arbitrary preference. You could pick any element. You could pick the singer and build the song around the singer. I like the kick drum because I like loud drums in my mixes. Let's listen to the natural kick drum and where it's hitting on my master bus. That seems good to me. It's not too loud and it leaves enough space for the other elements to come in. What I like to do next is bring in the snare drum and see if they're level matched. I have already pre-mixed this song, so I'm just gonna unsolo the snare drum mic and show you where that's at. I like to match these two elements because they're the foundation of the whole mix. And here I want to show you the polarity thing again. When you're recording drums, live drums, you tend to have a mic on the snare bottom. And as you can see here, these are also slightly out of phase. I could nudge this slightly back. Yeah, that looks fine to me. So when you're recording real drums, you have to flip the polarity on the preamp of the microphone that is on the snare bottom. Let me show you how that sounds if you have the snare bottom out of polarity with the snare top. Now, during the recording of this, I made a slight mistake. I had the polarity switch on the preamp of the right overhead mic. This wave here is going down when this is going up. The snare is going to sound hollow. Let's check that out. Do you notice how it goes from sounding hollow to suddenly sounding fuller and centered? That's what you want. That's why taking a look at it, at the phase and polarity of all of the tracks is very important at the beginning of the mix. You should do that constantly and revise that throughout the mix, because some moves that you do with EQ can also shift the phase of your tracks. The overheads capture the whole drum. I like to match the rest of the direct mics to the overhead mics. I have already done that. Usually at this point, I would also bring in the toms and the room mics. However, since this was a rehearsal, the vocals are already very loud on the, or not very loud, but they're audible on the mics here. So a room mic was just not that helpful. So we're going to use samples later on. I'm going to go through all the direct mics and turn on the noise gates real quick. So we can go from sounding like this to this. I know it's not the massive difference that you're expecting yet, but we'll get there. So one thing that I need to show you is the tom mics. Let's just look at this very mic here. I'm going to turn off the silencer and I'm going to show you the correct way to do it, which is not what I've done for this lesson. The correct way would be to take this mic and see where the toms are being played, which would be, for example, this hit here. Cut out all of the noise surrounding that and fade it like that. So when I play it, it sounds like this. That way you have ultimate control over how long the tom sounds out and you get rid of the bleed. I'll count this as mix prep. This is not mixing. So we're going to focus on what we can do with plugins and our skills. The way I'm doing it right here is I'm using a noise gate and it does the job extremely well. And the reason is time. Let's start with the kick drum and what I did to it. First, I applied the noise gate. I'm going to show you that noise gate here. This is by Audio, and it's really cool because basically you set the threshold and it cuts out all of the additional noise. Use these knobs to adjust how you think is needed, and that's it. It's very, very simple. On the kick drum, on the direct mic, I did this. Let me just turn on the EQ for you. What I did here is I boosted some low end, cut up some of the low mids, and cut out a lot of the mids of the kick drum. Let me show you why. Let's start with this cut here. This basketball frequency is kind of useless on a kick drum. I don't want that much of that. And the next thing is the mid range. This creates more space for other elements in the mix. And then I want a lot of low end coming from the kick drum because this is a rock song. So I boosted some of around 50 hertz. Going from there, let's take a look at the other kick drum mic, which is this. I only cut out some of the low mids. From there, we go to the kick natural bus. So I felt like I wanted a lot of low end from this very mic. So I added this plugin which is called BX Subsynth. And I added a lot of low end for every time the kick drum hits. Now, if you don't have a subwoofer, you might not be able to hear this, but this is adding a lot of stuff in the sub-harmonic range. Basically, everything below 80 hertz is getting a kick. It's getting a kick. I'm using this knob here, and the mix is at like 64% right here. The next thing I did is add a compressor on the kick drum. The goal is to add more attack to the kick drums. Now you can see here, there's a button called sidechain where I'm cutting out the low end, but we're not losing low end. What is this doing? Let me show you what happens when I turn this off. It has absolutely annihilated the kick drum. Why? Because the compressor is listening to the whole range of the signal. A lot of people think the sidechain is a low cut on the compressor. It's not. The sidechain just tells the compressor what to listen to. What I'm doing here essentially is I'm telling it, do not listen to anything below 250 hertz. So when I play it, it just listens to the attack of the kick drum and applies the compression to it that way. I'm having a slow attack and a fast release so I can just get a bit more slap out of the kick drum. And finally, on the kick drum natural bus, I have this EQ. Let's listen to that. I'm adding a bit more click to it, a bit more high end, and a bit more low end. The snare. Again here, the gate is applied, and then on the snare top, this is the EQ curve that I had to apply. The reason is I wish I had tuned the snare up again before the rehearsal. It had some off tones to it. It's not horrible, but it sounds a bit ringy in a not so nice way to me. So what I did is the following. Let's listen to the snare top isolated as is. I'm going to turn on the EQ. And I'm going to turn on one node after the other and explain what I did. First thing I usually do is I cut out some of the mid-range. Let's listen to that. Then I like to add some mid and high range. This is at 2K. This is higher up at 4K. And this is even higher up. And this is to pull things down a little bit after a certain range where I didn't like it. Then I like to add some of the fundamental of the snare to the mix. So what I do is I find the fundamental and I boost it a bit. And finally, this is when I heard I don't like the ringing of that, and I turn on these two here. And this. Now you can't unhear it. And I'm gonna turn on the EQ nodes for this. Now, be careful with moves like this. I didn't cut too much. It's like around 3 to 6 dB, maybe tops. But be careful with that because you can absolutely neuter your snare with a move like that. The snare bottom is a bit simpler. I cut out the low end, I boosted the fundamental range slightly, I cut out the mids, and I boosted some highs. Let's listen to the before and after. And from there, we go to the snare naturals bus. Let's listen to this EQ here. I added a lot of high end, more higher mid range to accentuate the stick smacking. I cut out some more mid range at 300, and that's it really. And finally, another compressor. Also, I wanted to add some more slap. By the end of this mix, you might be thinking, man, the snare sounds a bit too pokey. The reason for that is towards the end of the mix, I'm going to be adding clippers and limiters on the drum bus as well as the master bus with all of the music. And it's going to take down the snare quite a bit. So I need it to be louder initially for it to sit in the right spot in the end of the mix. Here's how that sounds. Let me exaggerate that by a lot so you can hear what it's adding to the snare. That pop sound is what it's adding to the snare, but in a much more subtle way. You don't need to be heavy-handed with compression because usually you do it in stages, so a few dB is fine. This is around 6 to 7 dB of compression right here. And from there, we move on to the direct mics of the toms. It's just EQ on the direct mics. Thankfully, the toms were tuned really well, so I'm really happy with how they sound. I didn't even use any samples at all for this very mix. Basically, what I did here is I cut out all of the frequencies that I thought were annoying on the toms. I boosted the fundamental, cut out a lot of the mid-range, and boosted some high-end. That's the principle for all of the toms in rock music for me. Let's listen to the first two tom mics during this short drum fill. And I'm going to turn on the EQ for this first tom mic here. And then we're going to listen to the second mic on the second tom. Next, I want to show you something important. When the drummer is playing a groove on the toms and he's being dynamic, you need to be aware of that situation because you don't want to cut off any notes that he's playing. This very gate here has this ghost function where it lets through more of the notes when you activate it, and I automated that. So let's listen to how that sounds. And then when it reaches here, it's going to turn off. And that way, it's a clean track. And the EQ is the same. And finally, the thick floor tom, which is played here. I was a bit more aggressive with the EQ, with the noise gate here, because that thing has the china right next to it, and I didn't want to have too much spill. And here's the EQ curve for that. Let's take a look at the EQ on the toms bus. Basically, I cut out the low mids, added some stick slap, added a bit of low end, and cut out the rumble that is not needed on the toms. Here's how that sounds. This one is very important. It cuts out so much of the unnecessary mid-range on the toms. It rounds it off so nicely. And then finally, another EQ. It's practically the same moves as I did on the other EQ, just with a different EQ. I like this EQ to boost stuff, and I tend to use it most for that. From here, let's go to the cymbals. I didn't do anything on the cymbals except for the hi-hat track. The only thing I did here is cut out a lot of the range of it. Basically, I only leave the highs because that's where the hi-hat lives. It's called the hi-hat for a reason. I'm so sorry. And here's how that sounds. The rest of the moves that I did for the cymbals are all done on the cymbals bus. First thing I did is this. So this looks maybe a bit weird. One of my favorite things about overhead mics is the sound of the snare. I love how snares sound in overheads, and I like to exaggerate them in there. So let's listen to this very move here. This I did to add body of the snare to this overhead track. Let's start with this move here. The rest of this is basically just taming stuff. I cut out the low end because I don't really need that much of the low end in the overhead mics. Then I cut out some of the high mids. Let me just show you this shelf here before. It's just darkening the cymbals slightly. These two nodes here were very hissy and very fatiguing sounding. Let me show you. Now, when I play this track here, you're not going to be able to unhear it. I'm going to turn on the EQ. It's kind of crazy, right? So that's the EQ. Then the next move I did was, again, on this channel strip, where I did some additional EQing, but also a little bit of compression. Let me show you. This is bringing forward a lot of the snare again. I'm boosting the highs of the cymbals slightly more to give them a bit more polish. Finally, I'm adding more body to the snare here. And the compression is here just to even things out slightly when they're a bit too overbearing. It's just a slight kiss, as you can see here. Just when the snare hits. And lastly on the cymbals is this plugin here called Soothe. This is a very dangerous plugin, to be frank. I don't think anyone needs this, but it can be nice to have in certain situations. So just be careful with it. I added this to just smoothen things out slightly. It's not a drastic difference, just be aware of that and be light-handed with it, otherwise you're going to end up with some problems. Now, however, since this is a rock song, we need more. I think we need a parallel compression bus. What's parallel compression? Basically, parallel compression is a secondary track that you blend in with the main tracks where there's a lot of heavy compression on there. And I have 3 tracks for that. One is for the kick drum, one is for the snare, one is for the toms, excuse me. And the reason I like to do this with 3 different tracks is so I have control over how much parallel compression I want for each of these elements. Let me show you how the kick drum sounds when I bring in the parallel compression. It brings in so much weight and so much length that I really like. I have this plugin called Talkback Limiter. It's a very heavy-handed compressor slash limiter, I guess, that just smashes the ever-living hell out of whatever you send to it, really. It's 6 dBs below the actual signal. Could even go lower or higher, depending on what you're really trying to achieve. For this, I just wanted more weight, and that goes for all of these parallel compression buses. Here's the snare mics by themselves. I'm going to add the parallel comp of the snare. And finally, let's listen to the toms. Let's maybe check this very section here where he's playing the groove. At this point, if it's not doing what I want it to do, that's where I would bring in samples. I have kick and snare samples that I brought in. The kick sounds are the following. I have this low-end enhancer. Then I have this mic here. And this one. And all these 3 together sound like this. Before I show you the EQ, another thing you need to keep in mind is also polarity. Since these are also kick drum samples, you need to be aware of how they sound in context with the real drums. So what I did is I flipped the polarity. I brought in one sample by the other, after another, and I flipped the polarity to listen for what sounds better. Is this better this way or that way? Let me just demonstrate that real quickly with this sample here. I'm going to bring in the natural mic. See how it basically kills the low end once I flip this? Let me show you. So basically I did this with the kicks and snares for every single sample that I brought in. And that's a necessary step, unfortunately. It's not fun, but it's very, very, very important. So next thing is some EQ on the triggers. This is how that sounds. I didn't need that much click, so I cut out some of the high end. I cut out the mid-range and brought in some low end. But I wasn't done yet. I brought in more samples, this time from my pre-mixed session in Superior Drummer. And again, here I have layers. I have this one, this one, this one, and this one. And together they sound like this. And this gets blended in together with the kick drum, with the real one and the samples that I showed you before. So there's a bunch of layers. This is what it sounds like. Mid-range cut, some high end, a little bit of low end, and cutting out the fundamental just a tad. This is the most important move. And then we're going to add another compressor. Again, adding a little bit more slap. Just a little bit. And lastly, I wanted some more aggression, but without turning up the kick drum more. So what I did is I added this clipper, and here's how that sounds. This makes it feel like the kick drum is louder when it's not. And I love that. And that's the finished kick drum. Let's move on to the snare and do the same thing. I have the trigger with this sound, with this one, and this one. Together, they sound like this. I added this EQ here, which is doing very little. What I was hoping from these samples is to get more ring, but a pleasant kind of ring, and a bit more length from the snare body. And then I have the additional samples from Superior Drummer again. It's this one and this one. Together they sound like this. These two are room samples, and we're going to take a look at that later. This together goes to the Snare Bus, and this is how that sounds. And on here I have a bit more EQ to boost some of the high end, cut out slightly more mid-range, boost some more of the fundamental. This is how that sounds. Good. And finally, I have this limiter on here to take down some of that pokiness that has been introduced on the snare. Let's listen to that. It just flattens it a little bit. That's the finished snare. The toms are done, the cymbals are done. This is how we're sounding right now with all of the EQing and mixing done on the direct mics and the samples. Here's how we're sounding. Finally, let's listen to how the room mic sounds. The room mic itself is there to give everything more depth and more length. I couldn't put up one during the rehearsal for obvious reasons. The vocals were too loud, but I added some samples, and this is how they sound like. It's a kick drum and a snare drum sample. I'm using this compressor with a fast attack to flatten everything and give everything length. And it's just some EQ to get some more high end and cut out some low mid range. And this is what that sounds like with the rest of the drum. Finally, we can't forget about the reverb. Reverb is really cool when used tastefully. Let me show you what I'm sending to this reverb. It's the snare, the toms, as well as those cymbals is what I did. The reverb is kind of delicate because it can sound a bit too amateurish if you put too much reverb on the drums, because they make everything sound really cool in the beginning, but they can be overbearing. So let's listen to the reverb bus. I'm using this reverb here called Valhalla Room. It's basically just loaded up and that's what you get. I cut out some more of the high end. Then I use this EQ to shape it more. Let me show you what that sounds like. And then I blend this in with the rest of the drums. And this is the end result. Let me turn on the rest of the music. Now that we have added the instruments, let's add a few final steps. We have this clipper here, which is to take off some more of the edge of the snare that I talked about earlier. Let's listen to how that sounds. Let me show you what it's actually taking off, because you can flip the delta, which is pretty cool. That blip, that's the front of the snare being taken off. And that is what I have been boosting all the time with the compressor. And this way it gets more even. I get more length from the snare, and that results in more body in the snare and sounding fuller. Okay, one final thing that I forgot to mention. My cam died. I apologize. We're going to take a look at some automation that I did. It's very little, but it's nonetheless important. You should be doing that all the time. This song didn't need much because it's dynamic without needing so much drum automation. However, I did do some. First things first, let's look at the cymbals. I'm turning up the cymbal tracks here, the overhead and the hi-hat, every time he plays the clap stack. So this is how that sounds. I'm also sending the cymbals to the reverb bus here, and every time he plays the clap stack, I'm turning on that reverb. So let's listen to how that sounds here, and let's turn on the reverb. And this is what that sounds like. That's one thing I did. One other thing I did is automate the reverb itself. I automated the reverb to be louder in certain sections. I wanted to give the snare more length. I wanted the snare to get a lot of space. Anytime there's a halftime beat, basically. And here. Finally, I'm just going to turn on the master chain, just so everything sounds fuller and louder in context of the pre-mixed music. And we're going to listen to all of this going from the pre-chorus all the way through the breakdown of the song. Let's go. And that's it. This is how I approach mixing drums. This was a very lengthy process, but I hope you took something away from it. Remember, you can download these tracks, mix them yourself, learn something from them. These are good sounding tracks in my opinion. They're well played also. Thank you again, Ali, for providing this performance. If this helped you, please don't forget to leave a comment, like, and if you want to see more, subscribe. If you have any questions, please let me know down below in the comments, and I will get back to you. I've been Mahmoud. Thank you for sticking around if you've watched this far, and I will see you next time. Take care.